Hello and welcome to another White Dwarf walkthrough. As you can see, I am fully recovered and I am very excited about today's issue. In case you hadn't guessed from my t-shirt, we are looking at White Dwarf 233. This is an excellent issue of White Dwarf. If you haven't had a chance, go find a copy. If it crops up on Warhammer Plus, reread it there. It's got 3 battle reports, 1 40k, 1 fantasy and a specialist games one, and that specialist games one is Battlefleet Gothic. This is the White Dwarf that featured the first appearance of Dark Angels in 3rd edition 40k. The fantasy battle report is Mike Walker and his own personal grumbly dwarf army. And the 40k one as well has got a cool, funky new scenario, which I'm hoping to play through with Mike at some point. So, without any more ado, let's get into it. First things first, you can see from the off, this is from during the run of the fat bloke Paul Sawyer's time as editor of White Dwarf. I think no discredit to any of the other excellent editors of White Dwarf. His run is my personal favourite period of White Dwarf. It's kind of the period that just I enjoy the most. But what I do not enjoy in this little segue of all the White Dwarf blokes who featured in this issue is the glaring nails on a chalkboard out of placeness of Ming the Merciless, fined unto Hans Zarkov, formerly of NASA, but Zoltar, King of the Hawkman. Massive loss of marks there, Zoltar. Unless someone's now going to correct me in the comments and go, well, actually, I think you'll find in the 1935 serial, it's Voltan. Gordon's alive! Anyway, we move on. Beyond that, we've got all the new releases that came out for this month. This included, like I said, Battlefleet Gothic. It had the Eldar release, which if you've seen my previous video, you'll know I've got sat ready and waiting to go and give Sean a drubbing. It had the release of 2 Dogs of War unit, both of which got their rules in this issue of White Dwarf. And there was just a whole extra little bits and pieces, like there was the Chaos Predator, the Dark Angels Ravenwing box set. Just purely gorgeous stuff that came out with this issue. So without further whittling, first thing we hit up is Regiments of Renown. So this was the expansion to the stuff that they'd done with Dogs of War. Dogs of War had been released as an army book. I've got it up here. For 5th edition fantasy, and it was great. It's got all kinds of cool Regiments of Renown. If you've got any of these sitting in your box now, A, you should just send them to me, but B, they are worth so much money. I mean, forget investing in gold, just invest in Dogs of War, I tell you. If they had a made-to-order of Dogs of War, I'd be a poor, poor man. But after the release of the Dogs of War army book, they then released further Regiments of Renown as time went by, and the rules for those were published in White Dwarf, and then later collated into a White Dwarf compendium. But so the first 2 we get here are the Giants of Albion. What's that, you say? You've got an elf army, but you really feel like you should be allowed to ally a giant in? Look no further. Here, have these half-naked troglodytes from that mythical mist-filled island of Albion, all geared up to come in and give everyone a shoeing like football hooligans abroad. This was a kind of a teaser for what would eventually happen in 6th edition fantasy. Of course, during 6th edition fantasy, for those who don't know, there was an Albion campaign event that they could do as an international campaign event where people could register their results from all over the world and affect the course of events in the old world, much like they'd done with the Armageddon campaign and the Eye of Terror campaign. But so this was kind of the first glimmer of what we would see on the island of Albion. It features Nigel Stillman's tongue-in-cheek approach to ancient history. So here we have the saga of Curious Geezer, the Riemann general from Tylea, who sailed to the mist-wreathed island of Albion to try and conquer it because, well, he has to do something because otherwise he's likely to get assassinated. And upon arriving at Albion, he is greeted by the war cry of one of the many giants that inhabit that mist-filled island of druids and savages. Bollocks! Bollocks and his brother Cactor, who are 2 of the most powerful giants on the island, throw rocks and giant boulders at him until his men basically refuse to get off the ship and just want to sail back to the Riemann where it's warm and there aren't huge monsters throwing things at them. Curious Geezer takes the approach of follow the money. In this case, he throws the army's pay chest over the side onto the beach, giving them no choice but to follow it, and then leads his army into the island's interior. After sort of several days of fighting against the druids and their armies of sort of savage tribesmen and giant support, a ceasefire is reached whereby Curious Geezer basically says, look, I need something to take back with me if I'm going to show that this is worthwhile. I need a reason to spare your lives. They in turn agree to grant him a hostage, and he chooses the two most powerful giants on the island, Bollugs and Cactor. They are accompanied by Hengist, one of the druids, essentially to act as an interpreter, and because he's just worried about the poor little lambs. As soon as, however, the Tylean fleet gets back to Remus, Curious Geezer is hailed as a conquering hero and assassinated on the docks. In the ensuing carnage, as everyone just scrabbles for a piece of whatever it is he's managed to bring back with him, the giants are basically left stranded in Tylea, no idea where they are, no idea how to get home, and that's why they then show up in so many different armies, wandering around the old world, presumably just speaking loudly and slowly to everyone in the hope that someone will understand them. Yeah, so Giants of Albion, this is a unit that can be taken in any Warhammer army. If you had a Wood Elf army and you felt like what you really needed was a couple of nose-picking, club-wielding giants to back up your tree men, there you go. If you've got a Lizard Man army and you feel like, a couple of dinosaurs isn't enough, what you really need is some giants. Here you go. There's an example here. So this is a High Elf Expeditionary army who've presumably promised to give the giants passage back to Albion in exchange for helping them out. Doubtless it all goes wrong, but there we go. That was the first Dogs of War unit that cropped up in here. The next thing that then gets hit up in with White Dwarf is the Dark Angel release. So like I said, this was first appearance of the Dark Angels in 3rd Ed 40k, and it was much like all the kind of Dark Angel, all the 3rd Ed 40k releases. It was a teaser for most of the content that was in the Codex. The Codexes were so slim that most of the stuff, aside from the rules, is basically sort of replicated here. But it's cool. You get a bit of an excerpt of the history of the Dark Angels, and this is, of course, in the days before the Horus Heresy novels, when we had kind of scraps of information about what had happened in the days gone by that led to the Dark Angels being the Fallen. There's some lovely pictures of some painted models done by the Heavy Metal team, including some of the new Ravenwing stuff. This showed really kind of a slight shift from the Red period approach to painting Space Marines, where everything was a blue-black with bright red guns, which is how I'm painting my Dark Angels, except my Ravenwing, to slightly more gritty, and what I think of was the 3rd Ed approach, with everything being that little bit more noir, dark metal, dark armour. Still looks very, very cool. There was then an example of Mark Bedford's personal Dark Angels army. And Mark Bedford actually is one of the two players who fights in the 40k Battle Report later on in this issue. But in particular, it's lovely to see one of the old style boxy whirlwinds. This isn't one that's been done from like a talcum powder box or anything. This one, it looks as if he's managed to rescue 4 hunter-killer missiles. So 4, 8, 5, 10. I can't do maths. Strap them together to make a really cool kind of modern looking multi-missile launch SAM battery tank. But the rest of it, yeah, it's got his Space Marine scouts in cool camo colours, features his Master of the Ravenwing on bike conversion, which featured again, like I said, in the battle report later in the issue. And then there's, again, just more information about kind of the backstory of the Dark Angels. I'm not going to read it all out to you. Suffice to say, I think it's all really cool. First of the battle reports then. This, as I said, was between Mike Walker and a guy called Ian Compton, whose Skaven army had featured in one of the earlier issues of White Dwarf. And it's an example of two really beautiful Warhammer Fantasy armies that are owned by the players. It's not one of the cool heavy metal armies. It's their own personal army brought in from home, and I think that's nice that it gives their idiosyncratic style of collecting sort of front and foremost in terms of what models they've then got available to play. It was also 3,000 points, which meant you got a lot of models on the table. Mike Walker, first of all, getting his excuses in early, and again, if you haven't read any of his articles in White Dwarf, he had a very unique style that I would think perhaps is best summed up as garage Warhammer. This was a guy who played with his mates in his garage on a Friday night, and everything about his style of writing in White Dwarf is conversational. It's anecdotal. It's making references to Small Dave and Not So Small Dave. It's filled with footnotes that reference little kind of jokes further down. In this one, for example, we have a reference to the dwarves' mighty choppers, and then a brief footnote explaining that this is not an orange motorcycle that was popular in the 70s, nor something that would cause a Carry-On fan to go, ooh, matron, but rather it's the large weapon that requires 2 hands that a dwarf usually wields. But yeah, he gets his excuses in early, and again, it sets the tone, I think, for the way in which this battle report plays out. That he wants us to know that even before he started fighting the game, that actually the reason he believes he's lost is because he's lost several brain cells due to catching an episode of Barney, or he's actually a pod person that's been cloned to replicate the principle of eating meat pies, or he just spent far too long writing his list of excuses to actually come up with some tactics. The tactics he has come up with is basically dwarf rangers. So he's got three big units of dwarf rangers, all armed with crossbows, all armed with great weapons, or in some cases axes and shields, and then a unit of hammerers, a couple of bolt throwers, a cannon, and a gyrocopter. I mean, you would hope that everything is all sorted for him here. We'll see how that goes on in just a moment. Up against him, though, are the forces of Clan Ratfink, led by their evil Skaven warlord, Rat-Arsed Rat. And again, it's the setting of you've got Bugman's Brewers versus a heavily drunk Skaven, and it's almost a battle of what's better, Bugman's XXXXX or Skavenbrew. But it's a gorgeous Skaven army. I think I'm doing no one a disservice by showing up some pictures here. And it's got one of those things I love about Skaven armies of the era, that it doesn't really focus on any one approach. There's Clan Pestilence stuff in there. There's Gutter Runners in there. There's Clan Scryer Wonder Weapons in there. There's Clan Mold and Monsters. It's a sampling of everything you get across a Skaven army, which is one of the things that's nice about this being 3,000 points, is it gave the players room to just include everything that they might want to play with that day. This, again, sets a slightly different tone, whereas Mike's already just getting his excuses in and wibbling on about models he loves from when he was a young'un. Which, I mean, I read this when I was a young'un, I can't think I dare to think how old some of those dwarves are. Ian Compton, on the other hand, again, he's writing out his plans from the start. He's working out what the best magic items that he can use are to work out the best way to get the most out of his Skaven. As you'll see in the coming pages, he absolutely does. So Mike tries a nice common dwarven tactic, something I've tried myself right at the off. He sends his gyrocopter hurtling down towards the Skaven army to slow them down, prevent them marching, and give his crossbowmen, who he's deployed in long, thin lines, as much time as they can to just pepper the Skaven with crossbow quarrels. In theory, this should work, because Skaven leadership is great as long as they've got plenty of models, but thin their ranks and suddenly those casualties start to add up, those panic checks start, and all you need is one Skaven unit to panic through another to start a cascade of models heading squeaking for the hills. Unfortunately, Mike didn't remember that was the plan much beyond his first turn, and aside from steam cleaning some of the big general's big clan rat unit, he then got worried that his gyrocopter might get charged and decided to move it away from the Skaven army, completely negating the idea that it was there to block their march moves. Not only did this put it in line of fire for the Jezzails, who promptly shot it down, because that's what Jezzails do. It meant that the Skaven army had basically nothing to stop it rampaging across the board, and in the case of the General's Clan Rat unit, this had rolled the best possible result it could roll on its Skavenbrew, perhaps proving that Skavenbrew is better than XXXXX. And I'll be cast out of my beard shaving for even suggesting that. But yeah, it gave the General's unit full every possible upgrade that it could have, leaving it to rampage across the board towards the Dwarven lines. In the meantime, a classic Skaven technique was deployed, that of Skitterleap. I have had this done to me myself during the games I played at Warhammer World last year. If you want to go back and check my Battle at the Badlands report, you will see that I had my Dwarven flame cannon all happily lined up, ready to blast away, when Skitterleap, a Skaven champion, jumped into the front rank of my flame cannon, got the crew into combat and prevented them from firing. Not that it did the Skaven much good, because in my game, the dwarves eventually killed the champion, came back, and then set fire to basically all the main Skaven units, as it's wont to do. Here, though, it stopped one of the biggest units of crossbowmen shooting in the most crucial phase. One Skaven, that's all it took, because it throws it into the front ranks of the dwarves. The dwarves have to then fight it in their next turn instead of shooting with their crossbows, just costing them that extra turn that they could have otherwise had to shoot at the Skaven units. It didn't all go the Skaven's way, though. Whilst the Dwarves were quite heavily mauled by the general's unit, smashing into their ranks, and then, because this was a breakthrough scenario, crashing through them and into the realm beyond and off the board, gaining extra victory points, the Doomwheel did what Doomwheels did, malfunctioned, and then proceeded to start rampaging through the back of the Skaven lines. Other units of Skaven decided they didn't quite like being shot with crossbow bolts, and did indeed run away. But the writing was unfortunately on the wall. When the general's unit is gone from the Dwarven army, there's very little left that can hold up those big units of Skaven from smashing through the Dwarven lines and off the board. And also, crucially, it didn't afford the Dwarves time to reform their units from those long, thin lines into nice big chunky blocks of grumbly Dwarves that could probably have taken the Skaven in hand-to-hand combat. As I've said, unfortunately, it's a smash Skaven victory at the end of the day. As a Dwarf player, I view that as unfortunate. I'm sure the Skaven players out there are cackling and rubbing their paws together and claiming just as planned. What I do love is this. This was the issue where, and this I think is something that, even if you haven't read this issue, you've probably heard of it or remember it. The Skaven player, instead of using dice or counters to mark the chunks of warpstone that his Gracie had, he used jelly babies, and at least he agreed to share the uneaten jelly babies with Mike at the end. One of the things Mike reflects on at the end is that he had that big unit of Slayers that he could have stuck front and centre right in the middle of his army. Slayers are unbreakable. It doesn't matter if that Skaven unit had come charging into them. They would have had to kill every single Dwarf before they could have carried on the rest of the way, and that might have bought the Dwarves time to deal with the rest of the Skaven threat. Lessons learned, I guess, and this is one of the things that battle reports are great for, is they highlight tactical decisions that you may or may not want to make, and just, it's a damn fine read, I'll say that for it. And at least Mike got his excuses in early. Next thing up then is Secret War. Now this, I think I've mentioned during my Silent War videos, this is something that gave me ideas, even back then in the 90s, for stuff that I might want to do with games as I kind of progressed in the hobby, and it's stuff that eventually sort of motivated the Silent War campaign system. So this is a scenario for 40k 3rd edition written by Jarvis Johnson. I'll throw it up on the screen here. The idea behind it was that this was almost kind of a games mastered scenario, which is a bit similar to some of the stuff I guess they did with Rogue Trader. There were 2 pages of briefings, one for the Dark Angels player, one for the Chaos Marine player. The idea behind this was the Dark Angels were tracking Cypher, the master of the Fallen Angels that seems to be carrying out some nefarious scheme. And perhaps if I do a video about Dark Angels at some point in the future, we'll talk more about Cypher. But the idea about this was that there were essentially 4 different objectives that the Dark Angel player could pick, 4 different objectives that the Chaos Marine player could pick. They wouldn't ideally know what the different objectives were for each player, and crucially they wouldn't know what the other player had picked. So when they had each picked a secret objective, then they could compare those on the following page, and essentially it's just, you know, you pick A to D for the Dark Angels, 1 to 4 for the Chaos Marines, and then you go, okay, so that's A1, that means we now go and play a take and hold mission with the Chaos player as the attacker, or B3, we play a blitz mission with the Chaos player as the attacker. D1, it's an ambush player with the Imperium as the attacker, and there's some special rules that get used or don't get used depending on what you pick. It's a really cool way of playing, and although this was, this was centred around the idea of the Dark Angels specifically hunting for Cypher, and the Chaos player even got Cypher without having to pay any points for him as part of his army, you could do something similar to this with anything, even in the current edition of 40k. I've got my Tempest of War cards here. I'm going to have a go at some point, I think, of just playing around with the idea of what would happen if, okay, you pick an objective A to D, you pick an objective 1 to 4, these correspond to different combinations of the Tempest of War cards. How would that create a narrative mini one-game campaign, essentially? Once I've worked that out, Mike from Tale of 4 Gamers, who has a Dark Angel army, I happen to have a Chaos Marine army, are going to refight this approach, and we'll see how it plays out. But yeah, that's the battle report that they did for 40k in this issue of White Dwarf, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on in the issue. Next up, though, we're talking about recreations of things, Elfin Court. So Thomas Pirinen here recreating Agincourt, but if it was Wood Elves versus Bretonnians, with the Bretonnians having to ride across a very muddy section in the middle of the board, whilst the Wood Elves shoot them full of arrows. I mean, yeah, I've got lots of knights, and Murray is doing his Wood Elves. Maybe we'll try playing this at some point. I'm not sure how much fun it would be for the Bretonnian player. It mostly seems as though it would go much like Agincourt would, with the knights getting stuck in the mud and peppered full of longbow bolts. But it's a nice idea, and I mean, again, it's for a free scenario, just something fun to play. Here it is reproduced, and there's nothing that would mean that you couldn't necessarily have reproduced this with an alternative army. What imagine, for example, a group of Cold One Knights and Dark Elf units trying across the muddy land whilst they get peppered with bolt thrower shots and longbow shots from a High Elf army. Equally, what's to shop an Empire army lining up in rank upon rank of handgunners and crossbowmen as an Orc force of war boys and savage Orcs try rampaging across the middle ground. Really, there's nothing to stop you adapting this stuff in any way you want. And I suppose that was the idea behind this little mini scenario, is take stuff from real world history and see what you could do with it. Moving on. So, brief just flyby here, a nice third ed Tyranid army, all in a kind of funky green and white colour scheme. I'm not going to dwell on that much, because now we get to one of my favourite bits. It's Battlefleet Gothic! Must contain myself. So this was where the Eldar rules were reproduced in the pages of White Dwarf. They did this for basically all the main 4 fleets. So over the course of a number of issues, they did the rules for the main ships for the Imperial fleet, the rules for the main ships for the Chaos fleet, Eldar here, and the next issue, I think issue 2, 3, 4, would do the Orc fleets. And it was nice in a way. I mean, it didn't mean that you didn't need the big blue book to play the game, but it meant that you could at least get an idea of what the different ships did if you just thought they looked really pretty and were intrigued by it. And it meant that when they do the battle report in a few pages' time, if you'd already read the issue that had the stats for the different Imperial vessels, you had an idea of what they did, and now you had the stats to compare against the Eldar ones. And yeah, I mean, this is all the Eldar ships that they produced at that time. And actually what's nice as well is, so Tim Adcock, who did some of the art designs for this, goes back to his original inspiration from Jez Goodwin's designs from the mid-90s. And then the sculptor, Paul Smith, shows off how he turned those artwork designs into reality, what his thought processes were. And from there, then, the technical drawings that they did for all of the ships in this version of Gothic, in the first 4 fleets. The pictures that appeared in the Big Blue Book weren't just artwork drawings, they were technical drawings of the vessels as well, which I think is really quite cool. Well, I actually had a bunch of postcards that they gave away free at the time that had those technical drawings on the front and then the stats on the back. I think this is one of the things that was nice about kind of Games Workshop at that era, was that they put the talent front and centre. They heroed who their sculptors were, who their artists were, who their painters were. It made you feel connected to them. They weren't just people, they weren't just a pair of hands to dip into a current controversy. They were a presence, a persona, and you could put names to who were doing the art and really kind of go, oh, this is Wayne England art. Oh, that's Mark Gibbons art. Yeah, I'm not going to say more about it than that. So, Battlefleet Gothic. There is an article from Jim Butler basically giving advice on how to use Eldar and how to kill Eldar, and then some errata that they had got wrong. And it's viewed sometimes, I think, as a modern phenomenon. Oh, these books have been produced and they're already publishing the errata. I bought this book last week and it's already out of date. Grumble, grumble, grumble. The Gothic was newly released. They hadn't even released all the fleet models yet, and here they were in White Dwarf going, oops, sorry guys, we stuffed up. But they were quick to correct it. And again, that's something the Games Workshop I think are still brilliant for now. You can go onto the website and they will produce the FAQ. If there is something that is wrong or something that was unbalanced and needs a bit of correction, they move in swift and they get it done. A funky army here from one of the Spanish studios. So again, I suppose there's something that was a bit different then. It's less a part of Games Workshop now, or at least it's less something that's talked about as part of Games Workshop now. But back then, there were separate studios around the world. There was the Spanish studio, there was the Italian studio that produced some fantastic talent, who were then lured over to the main studio. There was the American studio that were kind of cranking out their own edition of White Dwarf every month. There was the New Zealand Australia studio, who cranked out their own versions of White Dwarf. And yeah, here we have a lovely example of something that was clearly so impressive from the Spanish studio that the main studio back here in the UK felt moved to share it in the pages of White Dwarf. It's a beautiful dwarven brewery. It's some great examples of some hand-built, scratch-built terrain. The whole thing done up as a lovely diorama, and it's all a great example, I guess, of a Red Period painting as well. Gav Thorpe throws himself into the ring to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's come out in Dark Eldar. Dark Eldar, of course, were new at this point. They had been one of the first 2 armies that were released with a codex in 3rd edition 40k. They were the brand new, dark, spiky version of Eldar, and here we got our first look at some of their new models, the Mandrakes. And not only that, a model that one of the guys, Tony Cottrell, had converted for use alongside his Dark Eldar army. This would eventually get revisited when they did the vehicle design rules for 3rd edition 40k, but this is the Shadow, which is just a really badass looking version of a Dark Eldar Raider. And it gives you an example of what models you'll need to build your own at home, which I think is quite cool. Then we get staying with the Dark Eldar vein, we have Drashar, the Master of Blades, with his first model. And again, something much like what they'd done in 2nd Ed 40k as well. The rules for a new model being reproduced in White Dwarf. There was no kind of shyness about, oh, you know, you've got to go and download a code, you've got to buy a book to get the rules for this. It was, no, look at this cool model, and here's what he can do! In that vein, the 2nd Regiment of Renown put in an appearance. So again, Thomas Pirinen throwing his hat into the ring here. This is going to be Nigel Stillman's take on a Dogs of War unit. This is the Dark Lord Thomas Pirinen, Witch Hunter General, making his appearance here with Johan van Hal and William Hasberg. So this was vampire hunters, essentially. We'd had witch hunter models in the past. There was the awesome witch hunter model that had been done for Warhammer Quest. There was the idea of witch hunters in as captains or, you know, heroes in an Empire army, but this was very specifically vampire hunters. So you had wooden stakes that were blessed by Sigmar. This was, if your opponent has got the new Vampire Counts book for Warhammer and you are worried about getting your necks bitten, just go ahead and grab these. As you might imagine, any army can have these except for the Undead, or also the Dark Elves, Skaven, or Chaos armies. So they won't fight for any of the core kind of nasty dark ones. If you've got a Chaos army, you'll just have to use your Chaos Lord to kill the Vampire Lord, like everybody else. And if you've got the Skaven army, you'll just have to run away, like everybody else. But yeah, cool models. Just a nice little 1-page rules section on these. And yeah, not much more to say about them. I speed on to Bad Moon Rising 2. This, I suppose, technically counts as a 4th battle report. I'm going to count it as a half battle report. So this was Jim Butler and Owen Branham had fought a battle report in White Dwarf 229, and they'd said afterwards they were going to go away and do a rematch, essentially, using some more models from their own armies. And this is just... I guess they must have just done this in their own time, and the studio got word of it and decided to write up a little 2-page report on what happened. It's not much more than that, but it does feature some lovely pictures of their glorious 5th edition fantasy armies, and I think they played it out at about 3,000 points. Again, a nice big chunky value. I'm going to be using 2,000 points for my Return to the Badlands campaign later this summer, but I don't think I can brave 3,000 points. Asking someone to collect 2,000 points of Old Hammer seems fair enough. Asking them to dust off 3,000 points, even if I can manage it myself, is unfair. The Chaos Predator and the Spike Sprue. This is something that Caiaphas Cain made a wonderful reference to in one of his books, which was the period in which Chaos vehicles essentially seemed to be driving around with old church railings mounted on the hull. Yeah, the Chaos Predator came out, which is basically the Predator kit, but with some spike sprues and some metal grimacing face plaques that you could stick on them. And then this issue just shows what interesting things you can do on other vehicles using those same sprues. I think what's quite cool, Matt Hudson decided to use one on the top of his Black Templar Dreadnought, because, hey, they're spiky too, why not? But again, it shows an example army list of what you could use the Predator in. It throws up a 2,000 point Night Lord army that someone's just sat down to draw up using two Chaos Predators, both the autocannon and las cannon variant. Yeah, not much more to say about that. I think we're going to get on to, you can tell I'm too excited. It's the Battlefleet Gothic Battle Report, featuring Admiral Che Webster Rimmer. who, yeah, I mean, in the red shirt does look a certain bit like that certain Smeghead. But yeah, he's packing the Imperial fleet. He's backed up by, he's facing off against a guy called John Carter, who I don't think we ever hear from again, but he plays Eldar very well in this. And the whole thing's kind of run by Andy Chambers, who sets out at the end of the battle report the scenario, which is called Scenario 11. This is quite cool. There were 10 scenarios that were published in the big blue book for Battlefleet Gothic, and he basically explains this was the 11th scenario they wrote that there just wasn't room for in the book, so they give it away for free here in the pages of White Dwarf. It then eventually made its reappearance in the pages of Battlefleet Gothic Armada, which was the supplement they did for Battlefleet Gothic. But it's a cool scenario, centred around the idea of essentially kind of the Wolfpack hunters. So you've got a fleet of, in this case the Imperium, who are hunting for some pirate raiders, ably played by the Eldar Corsair fleet. The hunters get twice the points value of the raiders fleet, and the idea is there are 2 planets in the system that you set up at the start of the game. One of them has the raiders base on. In order to win, the hunter fleet has to identify which planetoid has the raiders base on, and then essentially put a ship into low orbit to bombard it to Smeg before the rest of the pirates can get away. The pirates, meanwhile, can set part of their fleet up in essentially on the base, so in hiding, essentially, where the Imperium, the hunters don't know where they are. The rest of it is then set up essentially as contact markers scattered around the asteroid belt that makes up much of the rest of the terrain on the board. This is a scenario that was perfect for Eldar, let's be honest, and the Eldar play it to the hilt. There is a requirement that both fleets take at least half their points cost as escorts, which explains why there's quite so many Sword class and Firestorm class frigates in the Eldar, in the Imperial fleet. The Eldar love escorts. I love Eldar escorts. Every one of them is, as I mentioned in my Eldar video, is perfectly tailored to do what it does very, very well. So this scenario is perfect for them. Got a deployment map. The way they drew the deployment maps for Battlefleet Gothic Battle Reports, there were only a couple of them, but it is a very cool way. It gives that sense of 3D space, even though as I've mentioned before, the whole thing is played on a 2D plane. The Eldar fleet is made up of a Shadow class cruiser and then it says an Eclipse. Actually, that's wrong. I've not noticed that before. The Eldar fleet has an Eclipse class cruiser, but the picture shows a Shadow class cruiser. So the Eclipse is the one that was the carrier vessel with the Pulsar Lances. But yeah, the model they've actually used, they got it wrong. They've used the Shadow, which is the weapons battery and torpedo boat. Oops, never mind. But the rest of it is made up of a scattering of Aconite, Hellbore, Hemlock, and Nightshade. A real kind of smorgasbord of all the different Eldar escorts. The Imperial fleet, on the other hand, literally just comes with as many swords as as Admiral Rimmer could get his hands on, some Firestorms to back them up, and then 3 Imperial cruisers. Just looking at this, he brings a Dominator, which gives him 5-power 12 batteries and a Nova cannon, a Dictator for that aerial support that the carrier wings that it can pack out, and finally an Overlord for sheer overwhelming firepower. The Eldar fleet set up with their escorts scattered around the asteroid belt, with the cruiser and some of the other frigates hiding out on the planetoid near the back. It doesn't initially go that well for the Eldar, as they kind of dive out of cover, I think too soon, while the Imperial fleet isn't broken up. They shoot away, pick off one of the swords, and then are basically sort of shelled to hell and back by the rest of the Imperial fleet. Things start to go wrong for the rest of the Imperial fleet, though, when they venture further into the asteroid belt and the Eldar player remembers that he's playing Eldar. From that point on, you have lots of little sneaky dive out from behind the asteroid belt, launch a salvo of torpedoes, or blat away with some pulsars, pick off some of the Imperial fleet, and then dive back behind cover again, behind the asteroids, when you use your second move. The Imperial fleet push in to the asteroid belt, but get bogged down before they can get anywhere near the planetoid. This gives the Eldar player enough time to pick off some of the Imperial fleet's core strength. And while they only get some of the escorts, they don't even kill any of the Imperial cruisers. It's enough so that when they bug out before the Imperial fleet's even found their pirate base, they've killed enough in terms of victory points that this is a clear win for the Eldar, which, I mean, yeah, it comes down to 292.5 victory points for the Imperium, 405 for the Eldar. It's a clear win for the Eldar. it's a great battle report, and it's funny enough, it's one of the things that made me want to dust off my Battlefleet Gothic and start doing an Eldar fleet, because I had an Imperial fleet, I had a Space Marine fleet, I had a Chaos fleet back in the day, but I never got around to doing an Eldar fleet. I just had a couple of cruisers sat in a box that I've dusted off, I've painted off the shadow, and I'm going to get the rest painted up, and then as you've heard me talking through to Sean during our brush talk video, we're going to play through this scenario and refight it exactly as it was done here, just with our own choice of forces. Can't wait. Right, mustn't talk about Battlefleet Gothic anymore. There is a section of Warhammer Monthly. If you don't know Warhammer Monthly, go back and check out some of my earlier Warhammer Monthly videos. I did a couple of videos just essentially narrating through them. But Warhammer Monthly, before we got the deal with Marvel, Games Workshop did its own comic line. It was published by Black Library, but it was known as Warhammer Monthly. As you may guess from the title, it came out every month. It had some amazing artists, some of the guys who'd worked previously on like 2000 AD, and some of the authors who would go on to become amazing Black Library authors like Dan Abnett worked on this. Here we have, essentially, it's not seen anywhere else. This is a Gordon Rennie story. It's some brilliant art by a guy called Mike Perkins, and it's a story of some dwarf lords fighting their way back through a hold to satisfy a grudge and lay to rest the remains of one of their ancestors. And it teases the upcoming Dwarf Lord storyline, completely unrelated to this story that's featured here, but that was featuring in the upcoming issue 15 of Warhammer Monthly. Right, so final battle report. Darkness Falls. There's a great little bit of kind of background story here that's been thrown in. It's detailing the interrogation of a Chaos Marine, a Night Lord, not one of the Fallen, but one of the Chaos Warriors who was part of Cypher's battle force here, as the Dark Angels tried to learn Cypher's location from him. Again, it's very sort of awesome description, setting out how he's kind of laid out on the cold steel table with a glass ceiling, with the chapter master and the high inner circle members standing essentially on the ceiling above him. So he's looking up at their feet, their boots, as they peer down at him, watch his interrogation as he's taken apart by the interrogated chaplains to learn what secrets he knows. It was Graham Davey and Mark Bedford that fought this out, with Ian Compton kind of writing it up. And yeah, Mark Bedford took an awesome decision. He decided to use purely Dark Angels forces. This was something that was made available to you in the 3rd edition Dark Angels Codex. You could use a Holy Deathwing force or a Holy Ravenwing force if you wanted, and that's exactly what he chose to do. The Master of the Ravenwing model sadly wouldn't come out until the following month, so he uses a Grandmaster on a bike model that he'd converted, and then he packs out the rest of his force with land speeders, bike squads, attack bikes, and one of my all-time favourites at the time, the Chaplain on bike model that was more recently kind of homage was paid to it, I guess, by the Primaris Chaplain on bike model. Mike has told me, and I've just noticed this is Mark Bedford, of course, and we've got Mike who's playing it through for me. He's got, I think, almost every model that features here, and he has been pondering whether or not to just use an all Ravenwing force when we refight this. Ian Compton, Graham Davey, meanwhile, was using the Night Lords from the studio army, so it was limited somewhat to the models that the studio had available to him, but still, he throws a hell of a lot of models on the table here. So you've got one unit of 10 Chaos Space Marines, then a unit of 9 and a unit of 8, 5 Bikers, 5 Plague Bearers, 10 Plague Marines, 7 Terminators, a Chaos Sorcerer, a Dreadnought, and Cypher. I don't have a Night Lord's army, but I do have the next best thing, which is a Red Corsairs army, and I'm thinking I'm going to try and kind of copy this as much as possible, insofar as throw as many boots on the table as I can. So it'll be all my Corps Berserkers I did for my Red Corsairs, my Red Corsairs infantry, Terminators, Possessed, Raptors, Havocs, everything I've got basically I'm going to throw on this, and we'll see how Cypher gets on. But yeah, the setup on this, it's one of these beautiful old maps that they did back then, with everything done as squares with icons on, unless they are individual tiny, you have drawn on a computer images of bikes, which I think it's a nice touch. Even down to the way that he's drawn the little kind of claw-like arm on the Chaos Dreadnought. The Ravenwing don't get it all their own way in this. They do a lot better than I think, and I think it's partly down to just how tough bikes were in 3rd edition. Of course, they had toughness 5. It was very hard to get the instant kill on them. Whereas, I mean, the plethora of melting guns, multi-melters, and high caliber assault cannon fire that they're able to throw at the Chaos Marines rips through much of the Chaos Marine army. I mean, the Chaos Marine bikes just disappear in a single phase of shooting. As it says here, the Raven were offended by the presence of the Chaos Bikers on the board. If there were going to be any bikes on the board, they were going to be black. But it doesn't go all their own way. They get bogged down with the Plague Marines, bogged down with the Plague Bearers, and essentially swamped, drug-rushed by them all. Cypher does go out, but of course at this point Cypher had that special 2-up save that was available to him that meant that he was whisked away by the Chaos Gods, avoiding the Dark Angels getting the victory points for him. In the end, it was an incredibly close game. It came down to Chaos 1,228 victory points to 1,128. 100 victory points in it. And that's it. But still, a Chaos victory. And an awesome way to conclude this issue. The back section, by this point, they had ditched the individual mail order parts that you got at the back of some of the older issues of White Dwarf, and instead it just has a slew of, hey look, here's everything that we currently have for sale for Battlefleet Gothic. Here's everything we currently have for sale for Dark Eldar and for Dark Angels. Oh, and by the way, would you like to pre-order some of the stuff that's coming out? So it shows up the upcoming Regiments of Renown that would be coming available the next month. So Lumping Croup, Tichi Huichi, and the Cold One Riders, and Ogla Khan's Wolf Boys. Yeah. We finish off with the back cover, a nicely staged, arty shot with a moon high in the sky as the Dark Angel Ravenwing bikers roam down the side of a mountain. It's a great issue of White Dwarf. I loved rereading it. I hope you've enjoyed me going back through it with you now. And thanks for coming back to me. If you haven't already, please do me a favour, click like and subscribe at the end of this just to keep up to date. I've got a whole bunch more awesome content coming. And yeah, I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.